Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hello and welcome to Railway Conversations with Doc Frank. Thank you for tuning in. I am Doc Frank, the host of this podcast, and my guest today is Stephen Lemon from Sydney, Australia. Steve is currently the global head for digital train control for a major consultancy company. Previous roles of Steve include professional head of signaling and train control for Sydney Trains, and he was also the program director for the Digital Systems program in Sydney. That's their rollout of ETCS Level 2 and arguably one of the most exciting and well-planned ETCS projects worldwide. I used to work with Steve on that program for quite a while. We had monthly meetings in Sydney, 8 o'clock in the morning for an hour over coffee. And during those meetings, we had some quite epic discussions. One of them we are bringing back up again today in the conversation, and that's the difference between complexity and complications in projects. I hope you enjoyed this. The second part of the conversation is about resource shortage in the railway industry and how this can be addressed, including a discussion about supply strategies for ETCS and a comparison of the approaches for ETCS Level 2 in Sydney and in Brisbane. I hope you like the conversation. If you do, please tell your friends about it. This podcast doesn't have any sponsors, so you don't need to scroll forward by 5 minutes. But I would still like you to know that if you're interested in modern signaling technologies such as the European Train Control System, ETCS, or communications-based train control, CBTC, which you may if you listen to this episode, then you might be interested in the training courses that are called CBTC Kickstarter and ETCS Kickstarter. They're called Kickstarter because they give you a kickstart on foundational knowledge of these technologies and their application, regardless on your prior signaling knowledge. So even if you are a complete novice to the signaling industry, you will take a lot of value out of these courses. If you don't believe it, just check it out. I have put the website down there where you find all the information about these trainings. It's docfranktraining.podia.com. Say it again, docfranktraining, one word, .podia, that's PODIA.com. Thank you very much for checking out the website, and I hope to see you in one of my fantastic training courses. And now enjoy the conversation with Stephen Lemon. Steve Lemon, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, good morning, Frank. Thanks for inviting me here.
Yeah, not a problem. I mean, we're going back quite a long time, worked together in Sydney on the Digital Systems project, which, at least as far as the setup goes, is probably one of the potentially greatest successes in signaling in Australia. Fingers crossed, yeah, if everything stays like this.
Always fingers crossed, yeah, with these things.
Yeah, true. I think in your current role, which is back in the consultancy industry where you've been before, you spent quite a lot of thought recently on project delivery and what can be improved. Last week was the Australia conference in Brisbane where you presented something. Want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was really interesting opportunity getting back into the private sector, and consultancy has given me a bit of time to reflect on some of my experiences, and I was keen to share that at Oswell and look at Oswell itself. Just to say, it was a great opportunity for everyone in industry to get back together again. So I really did enjoy it, the experience. And in the presentation, I think one of the things I realised was, and these are topics that we've talked about before often as well. I think a lot of the things that we were doing on projects and that I tried to set up in the Digital Systems ETCS Level 2 project in Sydney related to things I recognised and experiences from other projects and how to deal with those. But it was quite organic in the sense that from discussions with other people, we talked through the type of issues we expected to experience and how we might deal with them and what kind of setup on the projects have worked elsewhere and how that might be mitigate some of the risks. But it still felt quite organic and based on experience more than any kind of logical structured approach. And since getting out into consultancy, I've started looking a bit more into initially just as ways of better communicating the problem, but eventually just also better understanding it. Like, what is the logic behind it? Why do some things work and some things not work? And some of these approaches, such as the sort of approaches you take with the system integrator that we set up in Sydney, why is that a good idea? Like, why would it work? What's the logic behind that? And so that was really where I got into exploring this topic that I presented at Oswell, which was generally about introducing technology and not specifically around signalling, train control, or even railways, but just that's where my experiences are. And talking about mainly the difference between complicated and complex, which I think is a discussion we've had before.
Oh yeah.
And it's an established framework and model kind of that is I've seen discussed in a kind of academic environment, if you like, around you have a simple domain, a complicated domain, a complex domain, and then a chaotic domain. I try to avoid talking too much about the chaotic because that's not especially helpful sometimes. But and just to quickly kind of try and explain, really, the simple was about things where there are cause and effect relationships that are very self-evident, and so you can have a relatively simple process, and it's going to be completely repeatable. It often ends up in things like the railways will have them in operating procedures and things in that if this situation arises, this is how we deal with it. There's a simple process, it's repeatable, it's predictable. And complicated is still with the same sort of cause and effect relationships, but there are so many parameters that it's not self-evident what those cause and effect relationships are. So you have to do a lot more analysis and you have to get your experts involved. And this is where you say, right, we need to call in our experts and we need kind of detailed processes like systems engineering, etc. And they're still rule-based and they deal with kind of the same types of cause and effect type relationships, but the complicated nature of it is just there's a lot of elements really. And then you get into the complex aspects and that's where it becomes different. That's where if the cause and effects relationships aren't really there, or if they're there at all, they're only recognizable in hindsight. No amount of analysis is going to give you the answer. And if you were to repeat the same thing, run the same project in the same way multiple times, different things will happen. You're not going to get the same outcome. It's in no way predictable, and no amount of analysis is going to solve it for you. So what they talk about is the complex problems need to be solved. Complicated problems need to be solved, whereas complex problems need to be managed. You can't solve them. There's no right answer. There's multiple answers. And so when issues arise, how are you going to respond to them? How are you going to have things in place to manage them? So, I mean, I could go on at great length without going into too much detail, but there's also the chaotic domain, and there's not much you can do about it other than respond to it when it happens. That's things like COVID. When COVID emerges and you're trying to respond to that in a project, obviously that's not inherently to do with the project, and it's not something that's predictable. It's just, if there was a global financial crisis or some external event, then that chaotic aspect of it is not really something you can deal with or predict or plan for, but you've got to just respond to it, basically. So it's less interesting from the perspective of trying to set a project up to manage things effectively. But I found it a really interesting topic because it just provides a framework for some of these things that we've seen and experienced and dealt with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a look at your presentation. You were kind enough to send me the presentation pack, so thanks for that. And compared to the previous discussions that we had about this complex versus complicated thing, which is by now, it's quite a while ago. I think we must have had this in 2019 or something like that, definitely before COVID.
It would be almost 3 years ago now, I think.
And I kind of struggled to find those definitions back, because I thought, well, for myself, without that academic research that you have obviously done, I had a pretty simplistic understanding from my experiences in meetings and discussions with colleagues and so on. And that was that complex and complicated is often confused. Complex to me is something that's almost inherent in new signaling technology, for example. So if it's the first time that you introduce ETCS level 2 in Sydney, or if it's the first time that we introduce CBTC in Melbourne or Perth or so, then complexity of this technology is inherent. That's really nothing you can do about it. If you were trying to take a complex system, a complex piece of technology, and try to remove the complexity, the only way I would see is by reducing the scope, by making the system so much simpler that the original purpose is no longer really there. Like, for example, a CBTC would be less complex if you take the automatic train operation out of the equation. But then you don't have automatic trains anymore, so that means a lot of the expected benefits are getting lost as well. So that's a level of complexity you wouldn't really want to lose.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, again, they're ideas that can get a little bit confused, and in some ways, if you try and make something less complicated, you might also end up making it less complex. But that's not necessarily the case, if you like, and because they are quite different. And the model I found that describes it, and I'm gonna pronounce it incorrectly because it's based on Welsh, and so that's not my language. But I think you pronounce it Cynefin, but it's spelled Cynefin, and Cynefin, and it's a framework, and it has very clear definitions about simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And there's an area in the middle which it talks about, which is like disorder, which is just if you haven't worked out which space you're in, then you can't respond in an appropriate way. So you need to deal with different issues in different domains, if you like. But if you haven't worked out which domain you should be in, you're in this kind of disorder space. I'd recommend anyone looking up that model. Maybe after this we can find a way of putting up a link up for people to look into some of the detail behind it, because it is a very kind of formalized framework that is established with clear definitions that make that distinction more obvious for people. But it's really around the unpredictability that comes in complex, and the fact that you can't break it down to smaller and smaller elements and then deal with those in a clear cause and effect way, as you can do with is something that's complicated. And I think there are I've never found any perfect analogies, but if you like, they talk about, if you could imagine a kind of artificial life form as a robot, that would be complicated, but a human being would be complex. But the nature of the physical body and the different interactions and the way it works, you wouldn't be able to break it down and build a human body kind of thing. And when they talk about how to make projects less complex, there also are clear ways in which you would approach that. So they talk about, obviously, if you've got a huge multitude of different organizations involved in delivering a project, then that makes it more likely to be complex. And so simplifying that is one aspect. So sort of structural simplification is one aspect. Yeah. And then technology simplification is another. So if you're doing anything new and novel, then that becomes more and more likely to be complex. And so if you can use established technologies, proven technologies, don't do anything kind of bespoke or customized, then that just reduces either the level of complexity, if you like, or whether it is complex. And again, in stakeholder environments, you have a similar thing. So there's different approaches you can take to dealing with it, and tackling a project to make it less complex. But inherently, there will be some complexity, and that will mean risk for the project. And a lot of that risk is around uncertainty. And for me, the interesting bit is just having that framework. It provides a way of thinking about the project and understanding there are different aspects to my project that I need to deal with in different ways. And so for me, that's the bit I found the most interesting. If you've got the one tool in the toolbox and you're trying to deal with everything in the same way, it's just not going to work. And so for me, that kind of understanding just made it quite clear, and it gives you a nice framework. And whether these are inarguably perfect definitions of complex and complicated, I don't know, but the framework for me provided a bit of clarity and structure that I personally found useful, just to reflect back on some of the experiences we've all had on projects and think, oh, well, maybe if we took those bits or didn't do those bits or did those bits differently, according to this framework, that actually makes a lot of sense. And so I think that intuitively thinking this actually makes a lot of sense is always a good sign when you're going into something. But
to me, it seems to be a theory. And the thing with a theory is there's never just one theory. There are probably different theories. This is one framework of how you could structure things. The authors have probably thought about this for quite a bit and came up with something which to them looks comprehensive, and to you as well as you're reading it. So you seem to be a fan of that definition. I would like to come back to my own observation of complications. And to me, complication or making things complicated seem to be something self-made. Like, if you want to go from A to B, you can take a simple way and you can take a complicated way, which gets you around more corners and deviations and things like that. And the same applies to the way that you could think. If you're not clear which is the problem that you want to solve, then your tendency could be to make things more complicated than necessary. And that's very often where people say, well, I can't help this because the whole project is so complex, so our thinking needs to be complex as well. But what happens in reality, yes, the project is complex, but they're making it more complicated than necessary. I think you can have a complex project and still explain it in a relatively simple way, or you can have something which is very simple, but you can make it very complicated in explaining it. So maybe my definition of complicated or my understanding, my theory of complicated seems to be quite a bit different from the one that you cited from that article.
Yeah, I don't know if it really is that different. Again, if I think about it, simple and complex have probably got more in common in the sense that they're relatively easy to explain. The issue with complex is just its unpredictability, so the uncertainty around it. Complicated is just lots and lots of simple, if you like, added together, and to the point where it's you just need to do more and more analysis to actually understand the details of what you need to do. But you can make things that could be done simply more complicated than they need to be. And so that is almost a choice to make things more complicated than they need to be. But I think if you have complexity, then like you can avoid those bits by not doing it, but you can't really make something complicated complex, because it's and whether you agree with the definitions or not, the principle is kind of, and if I go back to however useful it was, if I go back to my analogy, if building a robot was too complicated, you could look at, well, do I actually need it to do all of those things? Can I make it less complicated? Mm-hmm. Can I can I create a simpler robot that does everything I really need it to do, and all these extras are just unnecessary, and then it won't be so complicated. But if you're talking about a human being being complex, it's a system, and it's the system itself that's complex.
Yes.
And so if you're delivering a project into a brownfield environment and you've got to deal with thousands of stakeholders, and a railway operation is probably inherently complex as an example, then there's going to be a level of complexity that you can't avoid. And so there will always be some complex aspects in that environment that you can't avoid. And what you need to look at is, well, what are the tools to deal with that? How do I make it more manageable? And that might be reducing kind of bespoke customization in the technology. That might be simplifying the structure and the number of parties involved in the project. It might be having a more collaborative environment to work with the stakeholder, your operator maintainer, for example, in a railway world, so that they understand what you're doing better, and then they're more on board and they're more involved, and then they can respond to things as they happen in a more agile, dynamic way and get a better understanding as you work through things. So there are ways of dealing with it, but I think there's a point at which you can minimise, but you can't eradicate some aspects like complexity. And I think the real challenge is probably that you need to deal with complexity in a different way, and so that's what makes it interesting for me. When you transition from sort of simple to complicated, it just becomes a case of, well, you need to do more analysis and you need to get more experts and SMEs involved. And if you don't, you'll probably get it wrong because the aspects are not self-evident, whereas as they were in a simple world, you can't just repeat what you've done before and expect it to work every time.
Mm.
When you go into complex, you actually need to do something different. And for me, that's one of the interesting. You throw more complicated thinking at it. I just need some more experts. I just need some more of this. I just need some more processes. That may not be the answer, I think is.
To me, simple and complicated are two different ends of the same scale. I'll give you an example, which is one of my favorite ones in the signaling world. That's the Crossrail project in London. So the signaling solution for Crossrail was complex. And that was because of the way that they decided to do things. So they decided they want to put CBTC on the trains traveling through the Crossrail tunnel, because that at the time was seen as the only option that gives them enough capacity and reliable capacity. But they also needed ETCS on those trains, because outside the tunnel, when it gets into the network rail mainline network, the trains would have to interoperate with ETCS. So that was a level of complexity that didn't really go away. So you needed CBTC on the train, ETCS on the train, and also TPWS for interface to the legacy signaling. So you had three signaling systems on board of the train, and that was complexity that you would always have, as long as your system design didn't change. So there was no way simplifying that, saying, we don't want to have ETCS, because then the train wouldn't have worked in the way it was supposed to work. Now, where I think an additional, in my view, unnecessary complication came in was that they gave the contracts for the onboard system for ETCS and CBTC to two different suppliers. It didn't change the complexity of the solution, because you still had ETCS on board, CBTC on board, TPWS on board, but by giving it to two different suppliers, there was an additional degree of complication. I don't really know whether that changed the level of complexity of the whole thing. I don't think it did, but definitely it got more complicated, and it could have been avoided. It could have been simplified by simply giving the entire onboard system signaling to one supplier, and then they can deal with those interfaces internally, which hopefully makes it easier and with better chances to succeed. Would you go along with that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think obviously I wasn't involved in the Crossrail project. I've spoken to a lot of people who worked on it.
Yeah.
And it tells you something about the scale of the project that a lot of the people I've spoken to who worked on it didn't even know each other, and yet they were working on the same project. So
yeah, it was huge.
But yeah, look, I think there are definitely some obvious ways of reducing both complexity and also reducing how complicated something needs to be. And like more and more functionality can make things more and more complicated. I think for me, the complexity comes with, it's going to be complex in a project of that size and scale anyway. It's almost impossible for it not to be. But making it worse for yourself by having multiple suppliers involved, creating multiple different interdependencies, if you like. We're not talking about kind of linear dependencies where one supply hands over to the other, but we're talking about multiple interdependencies between the suppliers and their systems and how they work and how they're developed and how they're going to be implemented and what you're going to end up with in terms of the outcome, how it works and how you're going to need to operate and maintain it. So I think the more suppliers you have involved, the more complex it's going to be. Now, sometimes that is necessary. I think anyone can tell you that there are reasons why you might want more suppliers involved, and that might be because you don't want a monopoly. You want to maintain a level of kind of competitiveness within the procurement process for things in the future, whatever it might be. There are often good reasons for it, but whether those good reasons existed in the Crossrail example is another matter. And I think that you can, in those situations, you can end up making things unnecessarily complex. And again, I've spent a lot of time recently reading about this, and there's a lot of academic work out there internationally in multiple industries around these definitions, etc. I can talk, I find myself going, I don't know if that is complicated or complex. It's not always straightforward, but I do like the framework just because it makes you think about why is this problem different to this problem, and what do I need to do about it, and how I go about it. Why does it need to be different? And I think that's really useful. That idea that to deal with a project that's complicated means you might need very detailed requirements that are very clear and unambiguous and perhaps in some cases more prescriptive than you might otherwise do to deal with very complicated. Potentially you've got a completely different problem with complex, where you've got emergent properties, things you can't predict, uncertainty, and then it's a case of, okay, well, if I can't predict it, I can at least put things in place to deal with it when it happens. And so, like, what are my processes and governance arrangements for dealing in an agile, dynamic way with unpredictable things when they emerge, with these emergent properties that occur. So I think this kind of thinking is more common in IT projects, etc. But we're seeing, and maybe it's because that kind of technology is more and more prevalent in our railway projects, that we're seeing more of the same problems. But you can't deal with the whole railway infrastructure project as if it was an IT project. So this is about understanding which bits fall into which category and how do I deal with them, and which bits do I deal with in what way, and how do I deal with that system of systems question of how it all comes together, and that integration question as well. So
yeah. So apart from that complex versus complicated discussion that we have probably debated to death now, at least as far as the listeners are concerned, they will probably say, can you drop it now, please? What other challenges do you see in projects that are currently running in Australia, and that, say, drivers that could make the project successful, and maybe some drivers that could rather be an obstacle for the projects to being successful, like the challenges for the projects?
Well, I think some of the things we're seeing at the moment, and there's a lot of things I could talk about. One of which is the makeup of Australia and this challenge of interoperability. I think it's a really important question, and it's a really difficult one to address, in that we've got a big country, we've got organisations, and we've got a rail network that operates federally. We've got multiple rail networks in states. We've got some trains that operate across all of that. We have a need for interoperability, but at the same time, the states are funded independently, are making decisions independently. They have an almost state-based obligation to get the best for their own taxpayers who are funding their own projects. And so convincing them to spend their taxpayers' money on things that benefit other parties is quite difficult to do in a business case. So I think this question of interoperability is challenging because the people who pay for it are not necessarily the people who see the benefits. So even if there is holistically a theoretical business case that says the benefits of interoperability outweigh the costs, if you've got one set of taxpayers paying the costs and another set of taxpayers getting the benefits, that's a difficult argument to make. So I think this is a real challenge for the industry. And so it becomes a challenge for individual projects because they're almost, for reasonable reasons, incentivized to ignore interoperability to some extent. And yet it's so damaging for the industry as a whole and the country for a whole when that happens. So I think that's one of the things, and probably the other one, and we could talk about that in a minute. And the other one I'll mention, you can then decide which one's more interesting, is just the resource issue as well. I think that some of the things we talk about, like CBTC being a great example, there's only a limited amount of experience in Australia. And so getting experts into the country that have the right experience and often you would see, and I wouldn't like to point the finger anywhere in particular, but I think there's a lot of people with good intentions doing good work most of the time, working on these projects, but actually a lot of them don't have, just by, the accidents of circumstance, just don't have the level of experience that is needed to understand some of the issues that can occur. Like how we get that experience distributed evenly as well across the country with the level of railway projects happening. You go out to market, this company wins this project, this other company wins this project, but then this first company wins a couple more projects, and this third company doesn't win any projects. And you've got expertise and experience relatively evenly distributed across them, but the projects aren't awarded in that way. And so when you've got constraints in the industry in kind of capability and experience, it's difficult to understand, look, how are we going to make that work? You almost just need to have a more pragmatic approach to how we deal with that procurement issue, because otherwise you're just going to have resources constantly jumping between organisations, or some of your best experts sitting around with no work, and other companies trying to deal with the problems without the right level of expertise, which can't, in a constrained market, can't be a good answer.
There are two aspects to it. I would see almost a separation between the supplier side and the client side. So for the supplier side, I believe, and in both cases, interestingly, in both cases, it's the client organization that can actively do something about it. So if we start with the suppliers, I see what's required is what I call a supply strategy. And Sydney Digital Systems is a really good example where this was really thought about right from the beginning. So you said for ETCS level 2 in Sydney, we think we need 2 wayside suppliers, not 1, 2. And in order to create an environment where you have 2 suppliers that are knowledgeable, that have a pool of experienced resources there that can build up experience for ETCS in Sydney, you needed to have 2 pilot projects, not just 1. And that was one approach as at that part of the project, what you could do in order to foster an environment with 2 suppliers. Because if you bring a supplier in just for some consultancy work, you help us writing a specification and then you can go home again, they wouldn't be motivated. That wouldn't work. But by having both of them doing a real project, they were motivated and they were sitting together with the client organization to write the specs. And now you have, at least for the time being, you've got a pool of 2 motivated ETCS suppliers that are doing work in Sydney. Looking in the future, it's up to the client organization again to maintain this pool of 2 suppliers by giving both of them work and not giving all the work to one and letting the other out to dry, because then they will close shop and go home, right? So that's something that the client can do for suppliers. Is that in line how you would see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with that particular project, as you know, I spent a lot of time in the early days with Bill Palazzi, who you obviously know, and worked on the project with me, helping me set that strategy up. And one of the things we looked at was that Sydney is just too big to have a single supplier across the whole network, and the risks associated with kind of technology obsolescence, with, you know, organizational mergers, with companies being awarded different projects and then not having the capacity to deal with other things, with us needing to do more projects in parallel than one organization. There was a myriad of reasons why we needed more than one supplier. I think in the long term, the whole network probably needs 3 suppliers, and that was our thinking originally, that but that we couldn't really start with 3 all at the same time. And that was this kind of balance between what do we need to achieve here in the long run and what will make the initial projects too complex. And that balance was, well, we can't, if we start with just one supplier, the first project won't be as complex, but the second and third project will be enormously more complex.
Yes.
If we can start with 2, the first one will be maybe a bit more complex than we'd like, but not too bad. And the next one will be a lot less complex, and the one after that even more so. And so that seemed like the right balance. And I think it was the right decision because, again, you can't always have that level of expertise in the client. And if a supplier tells you, look, I know the standards say this, and I know in the past projects have been done like this, but we think a better way of doing it is like this, it's not always that easy to know if that is a good idea or a bad idea. When you've got more than one supplier involved, you have got a sense check on it. And as you said, it's not just a sense check, it's a properly incentivized sense check where they know if it's the wrong answer, they've got to deliver against it at some point as well. So they've got real skin in the game. So I think then you get a better balance where they say, well, okay, this bit might make sense, but this other bit, that's just preference in their special technology. It's got no advantage to you as a client, and it's certainly got no advantage in terms of standardized approach or interoperability of other suppliers. And so that for me was absolutely one of the big fundamentals of the project, that the multi-supplier environment, whatever challenges it brings initially, in the long run, it will be hugely better for Sydney in terms of like the cost of future projects, and the competitive procurement market that will be retained because of it. It's a limited market anyway. Reducing that any further is just a recipe for excessive costs. So for me, it was the right balance. Time will tell. You know, there's no perfect answer, and there's no perfect way of doing a project, and there's no guarantees that things won't still go wrong and things won't be more expensive or take longer than you want. But I think we did the right thing on balance for the long term, and that balance between cost and risk and getting the right outcome for Sydney.
The interesting thing is that you basically have a benchmark in Australia, not far away in Brisbane, where you can compare the 2 approaches in the near future, because Brisbane is currently doing ETCS level 2 for Cross River Rail and in inner city with a single supplier. And I believe it's a lot easier to go from 2 suppliers to 3 later on, as you plan to do in Sydney, rather than going from 1 supplier to 2. Because if you have 2 suppliers from the start for writing your specifications, what will happen is they keep each other honest. So if one supplier comes up with anything which is borderline not quite standard compliant, the other supplier will cry foul immediately, and then they sort themselves out. So the chances of ending up with a fully standard compliant specification is much higher if you have multiple suppliers in the room. And by multiple suppliers, I would agree with you that having 3 or 4 would have made it much too complicated. So going with 2 is probably the sweet spot where you can get the benefits of a joint specification without making things just too difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I couldn't agree more in terms of that. I think circumstances don't always allow you to do it, of course. So, I don't know the circumstances leading up to decisions in Brisbane. I've been involved in the project recently, but I don't know the original decision-making process. And they just may not have had that opportunity in a pragmatic way. And so that's just something we were lucky in Sydney in that the setup of the project and the business case allowed us to make that decision in a meaningful way that would still deliver outcomes and benefits to customers early enough, but also allow us to manage this risk. I think, and I guess I'll be careful what I say because I don't want to upset any suppliers, but if I was in Brisbane, I might think, having started with one, and given the size of Brisbane and South East Queensland, they may find themselves in a situation where they're better off staying with one supplier than going to 2, because now that they've started like that, it might prove to be more complex for them than necessary and might make it unnecessarily expensive. And it's not that huge a network that they couldn't get away with that. I think in Sydney, they wouldn't have been able to do that. And it's a different situation. I mean, probably if they've had the opportunity to do 2 projects at the same time with 2 different suppliers, and then had a central body governing and making sure there's alignment and interoperability between them and that standardisation, I think that is a really good scenario, and that would have been great. But where they are and the circumstances there probably mean that kind of developing the relationships and from where they are now might prove to be a better solution, but only time will tell, I guess.
But they actually had 2 separate projects when they started. They didn't have to create 2 pilot projects as you had in Sydney. Inner City and Cross River Rail used to be 2 separate projects with different funding sources and everything. But then at some point in time, they decided to reduce complexity by throwing both projects together and basically making one party responsible for the delivery of 2 projects. And then it wasn't a very far step to say, okay, well, we give both of these projects to the same supplier because we then have to deal only with one party and not with 2 parties.
Yeah, at the moment, they're only doing, because of changes that have occurred, they're only doing the Cross River Rail project. They're not doing Inner City at the moment. And so that will be a subsequent phase. And, at whatever time they deem it's kind of appropriate. And whether that was a funding question or a timing question or just a resource capacity, industry capacity question, I don't know. But I think in terms of what they're doing now, they've got faster rail down to the Gold Coast to come in the future. They've got Inner City to come in the future. They'll then probably have to go north at some point, up to the Sunshine Coast. And when they make those decisions, there may be different circumstances than there are now. But I think certainly in the short term, once you start with one supplier, you kind of want to understand, make an informed decision and understand you are going to introduce a lot of complexity if you introduce a second supplier at a second later date. And I think that's the key for me is probably not what is the right answer, but just making an informed decision. Whatever the circumstances are, it's just understanding how much more complex it's going to become when you introduce that second supplier. I think Sydney's taking the right approach, and hopefully it works well for them. I may or may not be involved again at some point in the future. You never know what the future holds, but certainly I think they've set themselves up well for success, and long may that continue, I think, because it's good for if it goes well, it's good for the industry in general.
Yeah. I could say a lot more about Brisbane. I've got a pretty clear view there. And I basically saw many years ago when these 2 projects were thrown together that Inner City would always draw the short straw compared to Cross River Rail. So when it comes to any priority setting where a supplier says, well, do you want us to do this first or that first? It would always tip over towards Cross River Rail. It was crystal clear. So to me, even though Inner City had the funding even before Cross River Rail had, the moment they threw it together, I basically predicted that Inner City will just fall through the cracks, because it's very unlikely that with a single supplier, they really have so much excess capacity and horsepower that they can easily do both projects. And whenever it comes to a priority, Cross River would always have one. But let's have a look.
It's probably the right decision, but again, I've kind of learned from experience that there are so many kind of factors, organisationally, politically.
Let's go back to
socially that influence these decisions.
Let's go back to that resource discussion. And we did touch on the supplier side, and I think that the supply strategy would help a lot there to make it clear from the outset, also to the supply market, which are the suppliers, where's the pipeline of works, and then the experienced workers who want to work supplier side will be gravitating to those two, in your case, in Sydney, two suppliers, and that will sort this side out, I believe. On the client side, it's a different thing. And again, it's up to the client organization to do something simply by hiring the right people. I mean, there are a relatively limited number of people with real experience in those technologies, in ETCS and CBTC. You already mentioned the name Bill Palazzi. He is certainly one, with all the work that he's done for Sydney and for other cities as well. You are certainly one of those experts. I tend to believe I'm one as well. But I struggle with this entire notion of, we are so short of resources, we can't find anyone, we need to bring people in from overseas, as long as people like you and me are not 100% utilized on projects in Australia all of the time. So I think there is something missing. And maybe there's something missing in my own perception of myself. So I'm taking myself out of this equation. But in your case, for example, you're no longer working on digital systems, at least not for the time being. You do some work on Cross River Rail. But other than that, there are certainly other projects that could try to utilize you as an expert in that field. And you would still have spare capacity to help other projects as well. But it's not happening. But at the same time, those projects that are not utilizing people like you are screaming and shouting that they can't find experienced resources. So you see where I'm coming from. There's a bit of a mismatch.
I think that, again, I could almost go back to an analogy based on the complicated and complex thing, but I won't revisit that topic. But I think there are certain kinds of resources that need a level of SME experience, and there's a certain number of them, and you need to make sure you've got enough experts to go round, and there's a reasonable number that you can be relatively competitive about going to different companies for them. I think when you get into areas that are a bit more specialist, and that isn't always technical, sometimes it can be kind of more in the strategic space as well. But I think wherever you get into specialisation, you've got to be careful where you almost need to kind of try and cherry pick resources for the projects that really need it, for the more complex projects, in a way that government organisations can't really do. And so they go into a big procurement process, and a company bids for a job and they win it because 95% of the job is the resources that they've got loads of and that they can do a really good job with. But the other 5% or 10% of the project, maybe it is more complex and requires specialist resources. And it might be a really disproportionate amount of the project risk, but it's not enough to tip the balance in terms of which companies actually get the job. And so this small number of resources are scattered between companies. And it is quite difficult to get the right people onto the right jobs. And I don't know what the right answer is, but I do think the more that on the client side, the more that they look at a more strategic approach to procurement and start thinking about, in our experience, a lot of it will have been in the signalling and control system space, for example. There's a very small number of suppliers. If the buyout involving Hitachi and Thales goes through, then we know what companies we're dealing with in the kind of world of Alstoms and Siemens and Hitachis and Thales. If you've got that small number of suppliers and you know that they all have brilliant experience and technology that they've delivered around the world multiple times, then you can almost take a strategic kind of approach to saying, well, how are we going to deal with this? Particularly if you're going to do projects where you've got multiple suppliers who are going to be involved, to say, okay, well, we need to go through a procurement process, but can we create a framework where we can start to give the suppliers some visibility of a pipeline of work and some visibility of continuity, so that they can start to manage their resources and say, well, actually, we can bring on board some of these specialist experts because although we're not going to need them all the time for this project, we can see this pipeline of work, and so we can take a more strategic approach to how we manage our resources. So I do think that there's a limit to what the supply chain can do in this space, and at some point the clients probably need to take a more mature approach to the problem and think about how they're actually going to solve it, because at the moment I think it's evident that it isn't working brilliantly, that probably a resource pool that is big enough is actually scattered and distributed so unevenly and disproportionately that it isn't enough to deliver all the projects because of the way things are being managed and structured, not because it inherently isn't there are enough people. And so, it sounds like the sort of problem that should be solvable. We do actually probably have enough people. It's just, as you say, they're not all being utilised as effectively as they could be in the right places.
I'm not negating that the total number of resources may not be quite sufficient, especially looking in the future if we have an ongoing pipeline, which we have in Australia, where even more projects are coming online in the future and will be constructed. Then I'm not saying there is no resource shortage, that the whole topic is complete nonsense. Not saying that. But I still think at the same time, and that you kind of agree to that there is still a bit of headroom where existing resources can be utilized in a better way, in a more efficient way, to at least mitigate that problem to some extent, in a better way than it's been mitigated to date.
I absolutely would agree. Like you say, I wouldn't categorically say there are more than enough resources, because that may not be the case. But I would say that there are plenty of resources that aren't being used productively and effectively as they could be. And with a better approach to how we manage procurement and the allocation of resources and the way that we deal with the issue, I think we could be in a much better position than we are to deal with what is an enormous pipeline of work. And I think that is quite evident. So I think that we are setting ourselves up for failure a little bit if we don't do something about this. And I think that, there are things we can do, but I think a lot of it is a case of the ball's in the client's court to a certain extent. And they need to think about, how are they going to deal with this? How are they going to give more suppliers, more certainty around pipeline? Because whilst there is certainty around pipeline in terms of the volume of work, there definitely isn't in terms of which companies are going to get work and how they're going to be able to manage their resources. And, can they recruit and develop kind of graduates and new entrants into the industry without knowing what their pipeline of work is personally? And that is one of the challenges if we're going to kind of have the kind of supply chain that can answer the questions that we're asking about delivering all these projects.
And interestingly, this is not really rocket science, because there are examples in Australia, in the railway industry, where this kind of predictability of a future pipeline is given. And all these cases are success stories. So here in Perth, for example, I would count the manufacturing of rolling stock that we have just reintroduced into Western Australia. So they have a program for the next at least 10 to 15 years where they've got a secure pipeline of work to build rail cars for the suburban network and also for the regional network around Perth. And I believe that similar concepts exist in Victoria with the rolling stock strategy there for the local suppliers, for Alstom and for Bombardier. So everywhere where you see something like this, it's been successful. So it's not like the governments don't know how to deal with it. It's just not being applied consistently enough, if you will.
Yeah, no, look, it does seem that way. I would agree that there are examples of similar issues being dealt with and managed in an effective way that has given good outcomes. So I think it's a problem we can solve. But I think people just need to recognise, clients need to recognise in a constrained industry that they need to approach it in a more strategic way. I think that's the challenge. They can't just follow the same old procurement approaches and expect to get the right outcomes. And it's been shown time and time again that hasn't worked for us. And like you say, it's not like there aren't positive examples of how it can be done. So there's plenty of lessons out there.
I think that's the perfect summary for our talk today. I'm a bit conscious of the time. I probably kept you way too long, but it was very interesting as usual when I'm talking to you. And I could well imagine that we do this again sometime soon, because I'm sure we will find lots of other interesting topics. We probably could spend another hour just talking about the Brisbane approach, from what I took.
Yeah, look, and as you saw from the beginning of the conversation, I can go on a bit too long when I'm talking about an issue that I'm passionate and interested in at the moment. And so that issue of complex and complicated has got me engaged quite well at the moment. So I end up talking about it too much. But look, it's an interesting topic, and everything we've talked about today, I think there's dozens more topics we could have talked about, but it just goes to show what a kind of interesting industry we work in, and how much there still is to learn no matter how long you've been in the industry. And it's a great industry to work in, and I hope we can find answers to some of these questions to encourage more people to get involved in it, really. So
absolutely. Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for your time. And for everybody listening, I hope you liked that conversation. Please do the right thing, like liking the conversation, subscribing and sharing and telling your friends about it. And until next time, keep it simple. Bye for now.